filling up quickly. I'm going to start. Good morning from Columbia University in the city of New York. My name is Tanya Domi, and I am a professor with the Harriman Institute Balkan Studies program. The Harriman Institute at Columbia University is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. Our mission is to serve our community at the university and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together our extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. We are committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. I am delighted to welcome our audience to today's symposium, a three-part series today on the parallels between genocide denial in the Balkans and Holocaust distortion that is co-convened with the Queensborough Community College Kupferberg Holocaust Center, led by its executive director, Dr. Lori Cohen, who is co-convening today's symposium. Lori, you have some comments to make.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and welcome to Professor Rosensaft. We're very, very grateful to be participating today. As Tanya mentioned, my name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the executive director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Our center is nearly 40 years old. We were established in 1983 as one of the first Holocaust research archives on the East Coast. And these days we focus on three things: educational outreach, original exhibitions, and public events. And I'd like to turn things over back to Tanya.
Thank you so much, Laura. Today's keynote speaker is Professor Menachem Z. Rosensaft. He is also a Columbia alum, a double Columbia alum, who is currently General Counsel and Associate Executive Vice President of the World Jewish Congress. He is also a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, an adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School, and founding chairman of the International Network of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. In addition to his extensive body of publications about and advocacy for Holocaust education and remembrance, including recently a compelling piece in thehill.com earlier this year entitled "Holocaust Education is Essential for the Survival of Mankind." And Professor Rosensaft has also published opinion editorials on genocide denial in Bosnia and Herzegovina, including In Just Security, entitled "Denial of the Srebrenica Genocide Must Be Exposed and Condemned," and also in Haaretz, Rewriting History Like Goebbels, Why a Resurgent Far Right is Whitewashing Genocide in the Balkans. He is author of Poems Born in Bergen-Belsen, Kelsey Books, 2021. Professor Rosensaft will speak for 30 minutes, and we will take questions and comments from the audience. Please submit your questions and comments in the chat. And I want to give a very warm welcome to you, Professor Rosensaft.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for this gracious and generous introduction. Thank you very much, Tanya and Laura, for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor and a privilege. In the Jewish tradition, there's always the speaker who says, before I speak, I want to say a few words. So just to put ourselves in context, while I will not be addressing it today in my remarks, we need to be cognizant of what is happening in the world, what is happening in Ukraine, that we are witnessing atrocities of an truly unprecedented scope since World War II, certainly in Europe, and that I think is something we need to remember as we proceed. Ladies and gentlemen, on December 31st, 1959, a Roman Catholic funeral service was held in Madrid for one Ante Pavelic, described in the New York Times as Yugoslavia's top war criminal, who had died in exile in the Spanish capital 2 days earlier. For most of World War II, Pavelic was the dictator of the Croatian puppet state that had been carved out of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in 1941. While the same New York Times article noted that, and I quote, Yugoslavs have charged that he was responsible for the deaths of several hundred thousands of persons, end quote. It also quoted his former private chaplain, the Reverend Raphael Medic, as saying, and again I quote, Pavelic was a good Catholic and he died consoled by the sacrament. He was a fighter all his life for freedom from tyranny for the Croatian people, end quote. Let us begin today as we witness a resurgence of neo-Nazism, not just in the Balkans, but in different parts of Europe and elsewhere, with a reminder that the vestiges of Nazism and fascism, which by definition are the vestiges of anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, xenophobia, homophobia, and all sorts of related hatred, remain very much part of the contemporary political spectrum. To the extent that such manifestations occur on the fringes of society, they are perhaps unavoidable. Our concern must be when they are allowed to become mainstream, when attempts are made to rehabilitate the criminals of the past and to distort history by casting murderers as patriots. Which brings us to the sordid tale of a man named Dinko Šakić, or Šakić. When he was finally put on trial in 1999, Šakić was the last living commander of a World War II era concentration camp. Šakić was a fanatical supporter of the aforementioned Ante Pavelic, the founder of the Ustasha movement and prime minister of the independent state of Croatia between 1941 and 1945. Šakić was also an equally fanatical adherent of the Ustasha's virulent racist ideology. From 1942 until 1944, he was the assistant to the commandant, and from 1945 until 1945, commandant of the notorious Jasenovac concentration camp complex, frequently referred to as the Auschwitz of the Balkans, where between 77,000 and 99,000 Serbs, Jews, Roma, and Croatian political opponents of the Ustasha were brutally and sadistically murdered. In 1945, he fled to Argentina, where he lived comfortably for over 50 years until he was extradited from there to Croatia in 1998. One particular incident at Stara Gradiška, one of the camps that made up the Jasenovac complex, epitomizes Šakić's personality. Survivor Dr. Dragunin Roller recalled that in the summer of 1942, Šakić met a train of women and children brought there from another camp with two large police vans and, I quote, directed his guard to pack women and children into the vans, fitted a rubber hose from the exhaust to the interior, and drove around and around the camp until the passengers were dead. They killed at least half the group like this as soon as they arrived, end quote. In due course, Šakić was convicted of war crimes against civilians, including ordering or failing to prevent inhumane treatment, torture and starvation of inmates, and personally executing quite a few of them. In explaining the verdict, Chief Judge Drazen Tripalo noted that Jews, Serbs, and Roma were killed at Jasenovac solely because of their ethnicity. Šakić was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. I've gone into some detail regarding Šakić so as to leave no doubt whatsoever that he was a war criminal who perpetrated atrocities against men, women, and children that should have placed him outside the pale of any civilized society. And yet, when Šakić died in 2008, the Croatian Catholic Church accorded him a hero's funeral. Šakić was buried wearing a Ustasha uniform, and the priest who performed the funeral mass eulogized the erstwhile Jasenovac commandant as a role model. Father Vjekoslav Vlasic said that, quote, every decent Croat should be proud of Šakić's name, end quote. The same Father Vlasic has also conducted funeral masses for Pavelić, as have other priests of the Croatian Catholic Church. I cannot think of a more effective way of rehabilitating a murderous criminal than by having him honored and his record not just whitewashed, but shamelessly distorted by the church. Ante Pavelić was a good Catholic, Father Luca Percella told the New York Times in 1997. He went to Mass daily in his own chapel. Many of the crimes alleged to have been committed by his government never happened. These stories were lies spread by the communists. He fought for a free Catholic Croatia. The dog whistle to the faithful is clear. Pavelić and Šakić, and by extension the Ustasha as a whole, are being brought back into polite society to the delight of far-right ethno-nationalist extremists. This phenomenon lies at the heart of the themes I would like to explore with you today, namely the brazen attempt by ultranational elements in Croatia to rehabilitate the Ustasha, accompanied by the distortion, if not outright denial, of the crimes committed by the Ustasha, as well as the denial of the Srebrenica genocide by equally extremist ethno-national individuals and groups in Republika Srpska in Serbia. I believe that these two phenomena have similar roots that are, in fact, inexorably linked, and they are indicative of a broader threat to democracy generally. First, let us remind ourselves that one of the root ingredients of anti-democratic fascism is, to put it mildly, nationalism on steroids. Just to make sure we are all working from the same definition, let us remind ourselves that fascism was and is a far-right authoritarian and ultra-nationalist ideology. Moreover, it is predicated more often than not on a belief in racist or ethnic superiority, coupled with often violent xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of bigotry. I want to emphasize today that there is nothing whatsoever wrong with taking pride in one's country, or with making the interests of one's country and its population a top priority. The problem begins when nationalism becomes a weapon against, quote, the other. And the other can be any racial, ethnic, religious, political, or intellectual minority, or for that matter, any group defined by a particular characteristic, including gender or sexual orientation, that the self-proclaimed majority chooses to target as its enemy, and therefore cast as the enemy of society as a whole. Against this background, let us first look at Croatia. During the Second World War, homegrown fascist movements throughout Europe joined Nazi Germany in perpetrating genocide and crimes against humanity against minorities in their respective countries. The Ustasha was one such movement. Between 1941 and 1945 in the independent state of Croatia, the Ustasha, led by Pavelić, aggressively and ardently murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs and tens of thousands of Jews, as well as many Roma and Croatian political opponents, It is critically important to emphasize that the Ustasha's racism was indigenous and voluntary. It was not in any way imposed on the independent state of Croatia by the Germans or anyone else. The racial laws enacted in the independent state of Croatia were crafted by the Ustasha's ideologues as a central element of their ethno-nationalist worldview. According to the law concerning nationality promulgated on April 30th, 1941, a Croatian, quote, citizen is a national of Aryan origin. Less than 2 months later, on July 27, 1941, Foreign Minister Mladen Lorković declared that the mission of the independent state of Croatia was to, and I quote, cleanse itself of all those elements that are the misfortune of the nation, that drain healthy forces in our nation. These are our Serbs and Jews, end quote. Recognizing that the Ustasha was a criminal genocidal movement must be the starting point of any discussion of the independent state of Croatia and the Ustasha between 1941 and 1945. The Ustasha was the functional equivalent of Hitler's Nazi movement and party. Any attempt to whitewash or rehabilitate either movement is a desecration of the memory of the respective victims of Nazism and the Ustasha, and a deliberate, conscious attempt to distort history. Not to put too fine a point on it, the Ustasha were not Croatian patriots. They were a gang of brutal murderers. For some time now, however, we have been witnessing a widespread campaign to rehabilitate and legitimize the Ustasha by characterizing it and its members instead as patriots rather than as cold-blooded murderers and war criminals. This is a blatant falsification of history. We know that the Ustasha established a network of concentration camps infamous for their brutality. I mentioned Jasenovac a while back. This is a historical fact. And yet, extremist right-wing elements in Croatia have for years tried to sanitize the interrelated connotation of Jasenovac and the Ustasha. In 2016, for example, Jakov Sedlar, a controversial Croatian filmmaker, produced a documentary film entitled Jasenovac, The Truth, which portrayed Jasenovac as a benign labor camp whose number of victims had been greatly exaggerated. Along the same lines, to cite one other egregious example, 2 years later in 2018, Milan Ivkošić, a prominent Croatian journalist, praised a revisionist book that similarly cast Jasenovac as a mere labor camp. In a column entitled Jasenovac Cleansed of Ideology, Bias, and Communist Forgery, Ivkošić wrote in the daily newspaper Večernji List that while conditions at Jasenovac may have been severe, quote, there was fun in the camp. There were sporting matches, especially football, concerts, theatrical performances, among which were pieces that were created by the inmates themselves, end quote. Fun at Jasenovac? Ivkošić's attempt to cleanse Jasenovac and the Ustasha of their evil essence is reprehensible. So his contemptuous reference to a myth of Jasenovac. I don't want to go into over detail, because this is not a session devoted to Jasenovac or Holocaust history, but we know that the brutality at Jasenovac was in some ways worse than the methodical killing that took place at places like Auschwitz and Treblinka. Equally troubling is the widespread use of the Ustasha slogan, Zadom Spremni, or ready for the homeland, as a euphemism for racist or xenophobic slurs that are, in theory at least, prohibited under Croatian law. Let's be clear on this point. Zadom Spremni is exactly the same as the Nazi salutes Heil Hitler and Sieg Heil. These salutes accompanied the persecution, oppression, and murders of the Nazis and Ustasha's victims. And as such, they must forever be identified with these genocidal crimes. That is why the use of Zadom Spremni on the contemporary Croatian scene is so deeply troubling and leaves little to the imagination. Football fans, meaning soccer fans, who shouted in sports stadiums endorsed, consciously or perhaps subconsciously, the xenophobic racist ideology represented by the salute, and in so doing glorify the Ustasha and all its representatives. And what we need to be concerned about most is the fact that the Croatian authorities, for the most part, turn a blind eye to the reintegration of Ustasha terminology and Ustasha symbolism into their country's contemporary culture and, by extension, into the wider Croatian political mindset. Let us now move next door for a few minutes to Republika Srpska, the Serb-dominated entity within the precarious multi-ethnic state of Bosnia and Herzegovina that emerged from the 1995 Dayton Accord. And more specifically, let us consider the phenomenon of Srebrenica genocide denial. Once again, as with Ustasha and Jasenovac, the facts are well established, despite ongoing effort to distort and even outright deny them. Only while there is at least an element of subtlety in the Croatian campaign to rehabilitate the Ustasha, the denial of the Srebrenica genocide has become a matter of not just nationalist, but national policy. Let's step back for a moment and imagine the international outrage if murals of Adolf Hitler were to be prominently displayed throughout Germany, or if a Berlin student dormitory were to be named after Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the systematic annihilation of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Imagine further the across-the-board condemnation of any German government delusional enough to claim as a matter of policy that the Holocaust was not a genocide and that the Jews brought their mass slaughter upon themselves. Precisely this type of scenario has been playing itself out with regard to the genocide perpetrated by Bosnian Serb troops more than 26 years ago against Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, in around the town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia. Once again, the underlying relevant facts are quite clear and quite clear-cut. During the brutally fought 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War, the paramilitary forces of the Bosnian Serb breakaway proto-state known as Republika Srpska, with the support of the neighboring Serbian government, engaged in a savage campaign to expel non-Serb from the predominantly ethnic Serb part of Bosnia. In 1993, the United Nations Security Council designated Srebrenica and its surroundings as a safe area which should be free from any armed attack or other hostile act. This safe area, where thousands of Bosniaks sought refuge, was under UN protection. Over the course of several days, beginning on July 11, 1995, Bosnian Serb troops commanded by General Ratko Mladic murdered approximately 8,000 Muslim men and boys between the ages of 12 and 77 from the Srebrenica enclave. Mladic's forces also forcibly expelled around 25,000 Bosniak women, children, and elderly men from Srebrenica. The 1948 UN Genocide Convention provides that killing members of a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group with the intent to destroy in whole or in part that group as such constitute the crime of genocide under international law. To date, 6 Bosnian Serbs, including Mladic and the erstwhile Republika Srpska President Radovan Karadzic, have been convicted of genocide by the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, in connection with the Srebrenica killings. In 2007, the International Court of Justice in The Hague held that, and again, I'm quoting, the acts committed at Srebrenica were committed with the specific intent to destroy in part the group of the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina as such, and accordingly that these acts were genocide, end quote. Along the same lines, in its judgment convicting Karadzic of genocide, the ICTY trial chamber wrote that the only reasonable inference to be drawn from the killing of the Bosniak men and boys of Srebrenica, quote, is that members of the Bosnian Serb forces orchestrating this operation intended to destroy the Bosnian Muslims as such, end quote. Rather than acknowledging responsibility for the carnage, however, ultranationalist Republika Srpska politicians and their acolytes have spent the past 26 years denying that what took place at Srebrenica constituted a genocide, and instead are shamelessly fabricating an alternate and false scenario. In 2020, the Srebrenica Potocari Memorial Center issued a report on Srebrenica genocide denial that documents the revisionist initiative by politicians and pseudo-academics to distort history. The efforts range from attempts to dispute the death toll to blaming the victims for the slaughter by claiming that it was a reaction to Bosniak provocations. Thus, Milorad Dodik, the Serb member of the tripartite presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, called the Srebrenica genocide a fabricated myth and has declared categorically that, quote, genocide did not happen, Serbs must never accept this, end quote. And Republika Srpska President Željko Cvijanović has pointedly suggested that the killing of Bosniaks at Srebrenica was retaliation for prior anti-Serb war crimes against Serbs, purportedly committed by Bosnian Muslim forces. Incidentally, not relevant to our discussion today, but still interesting, both Dodik and Cvijanović were sanctioned earlier this week by the United Kingdom for, in the words of Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, deliberately undermining the hard-won peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Encouraged by Putin, their reckless behavior threatens stability and security across the Western Balkans. Dodik had previously also been sanctioned by the US Treasury Department. It gets worse. The perpetrators of the Srebrenica genocide are lionized in present-day Republika Srpska. Enormous murals of Ratko Mladic throughout Republika Srpska and in Serbia glorify Mladic, and a student dormitory was named with great fanfare for Karadzic. This truly is the functional equivalent of turning Adolf Eichmann into a folk hero. Last July, a purportedly independent commission appointed by the Republika Srpska authorities and headed by Gideon Greif, a controversial Israeli academic, issued a more than 1,000-page long report that shamelessly and under the guise of pseudo-scholarship categorically reject the proposition that a genocide was perpetrated at Srebrenica. The report, simply put, is an abomination that not only blatantly ignores one ICTY judgment after another, but it depicts as gospel the writings of largely discredited Srebrenica genocide deniers without addressing the writings of historians and legal scholars who have reached diametrically different conclusions. The report engages predictably in the age-old rationalization of blaming the victims for the racial, ethnic, or religiously motivated decimation committed against them, and for good measure, disparages as illegitimate and politically biased, not just the ICTY, but just about all war crimes trials, beginning with Nuremberg. The report goes to considerable and unbearable lengths to dismiss as victor's justice and retributive justice, not just the ICTY, but the very rationales on which the international military tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo were predicated. Yet another distasteful aspect of the Greif report is its author's apparent determination to hold the Bosniaks responsible for the action of the Republika Srpska troops, essentially blaming the victims. A large part of the report is devoted to the genocide perpetrated by the Ustasha against Serbs and Jews during World War II, as well as lengthy accounts of purported Bosniak aggressive actions beginning in 1991. According to this particular argument, Bosnian Serbs killed Bosniaks at Srebrenica not as part of a genocide, but either, take your pick, as retaliation or to prevent future military actions by the aforesaid Bosniaks. The Greif report also repeatedly cast the Bosniaks as aggressors and the Bosnian Serbs as victims, in a rewriting of history reminiscent of Third Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' justification of the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies. Accusing Albert Einstein and the German Jewish writers Emil Ludwig and Leon Feuchtwanger of waging an atrocity campaign against Germany, Goebbels declared in April of 1933, only a few months after Hitler came to power, that, and I quote, "The German nation was ready to leave the Jewish question abeyance if Judaism will leave the German nation alone," end quote. 8.5 years later, in November 1941, with the early stages of the Holocaust underway, Goebbels wrote in the weekly newspaper Das Reich, and I quote, "If international finance Jewry should succeed in plunging the world into war once again, the result will be not the Bolshevization of the world and thereby the victory of the Jews, but rather the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. Every Jew is our enemy in this historic struggle. The Jews must be removed from the German community, for they endanger our national security," end quote. This is precisely the type of obscene argument we see in the Greif report as a subliminal justification for what occurred in Srebrenica. The Bosniaks brought the genocide, which the report denies was a genocide, on themselves. Don't blame Mladic, don't blame Karadzic, don't blame the Republika Srpska thugs who shot thousands of unarmed men and boys to death. It's so much simpler and so much more convenient to blame the Bosniaks instead. If a student of mine at Columbia or Cornell Law School were to present this type of argument in a term paper in my course in the law of genocide, they would not receive a passing grade. Grive himself, who has become a poster child for Srebrenica genocide denial, is particularly contemptible. Cloaking himself in the mantle of Jewish victimhood, he declared arrogantly on Republika Srpska television after submitting his report that, quote, "I am Jewish. I know what genocide means. Nobody can tell me what genocide is, and this event was no genocide," end quote. The grim reality is that Jasenovac and Srebrenica were among the 20th century's most notorious manifestation of genocide, and both were perpetrated by adherents of indigenous extremist ethno-nationalist ideologies. These mindsets and their proponents are still very much in evidence. Accordingly, the ongoing brazen attempt to deny and distort these gruesome atrocities that we are witnessing in Croatia, Republika Srpska, and elsewhere do not merely showcase the moral and ideological bankruptcy of genocide deniers. Far more ominously, they are a reminder of the resilience and resurgence of the political extremism that provided fertile genocide in the first place. One final point, if I may. I have spoken here at some length about both Jasenovac and the Srebrenica genocide because each needs to be a permanent part of our collective consciousness. Specifically, I do not believe in engaging in comparative suffering or in comparing the scope or heinous nature of different genocides or crimes against humanity. All victims of such atrocities deserve the dignity and respect of having their agony and suffering recognized and remembered. Auschwitz survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel taught that, I quote, "The Holocaust was a unique and uniquely Jewish event, albeit with universal implication," end quote. In the same vein, I believe that the Srebrenica genocide was a unique and uniquely Bosniak event, albeit with universal implications, just as the Rwandan genocide was a unique and uniquely Tutsi event, albeit also with universal implication. Each genocide and each crime against humanity must be seen as a unique event from the perspective and through the prism of its victim, but always, always with universal implications. It is precisely because I am the son of survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, and because my parents' entire immediate families were murdered in the Holocaust, that I believe I must do all I can to prevent other genocides and crimes against humanity from happening. Sadly, tragically, the international community has failed utterly in protecting the victims of genocide in places like Darfur, Srebrenica, and Rwanda. But I also believe that it's only by making sure that past horrors are integrated into the world's consciousness that we have at least a chance to prevail against the forces of darkness that threaten humankind as a whole. And these are the forces of bigotry, anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, and hatred generally. We must at all times be guided by and advocate as forcefully as we can on behalf of the integrity of historical truth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosensaft. I'm deeply educated and moved by your comments. We do have some comments from the audience. I want our audience to know that this is being recorded and it will be available to anyone after the event on our YouTube channel. A question from the audience is, please comment on the US government's efforts to find and remove Bosnian war criminals who have entered the United States as refugees.
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, to the extent that they are here, they should be arrested, they should be extradited to Bosnia, and they should be put on trial in exactly the same way as that Nazi war criminals were extradited and deported by the US Justice Department Office of Special Investigation. There are some legal complications. With respect to Srebrenica, it's fairly clear-cut that the US genocide statute can be used in order to arrest them. With respect to other crimes against humanity that were committed by Bosnian Serb forces, and there were many, many of those, it's a little bit more complicated, but absolutely, they should not be allowed to find refuge here. But this is not a new problem. And unfortunately, you always have indigenous populations that try to protect them. And just as Nazi war criminals had the support of certain American politicians like the unlamented Pat Buchanan, who never met a Nazi war criminal he didn't support, we have the similar phenomenon happening with respect to Bosnia.
I want to ask Dr. Cohen, do you want to ask Professor Rosensaft a question? You should know, Professor Rosensaft, that Laura did her dissertation on Srebrenica and the memorial there.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you so much, Professor Rosensaft. I was sitting here just listening and kind of nodding my head at all the things that you've mentioned. And during the times that I've been to Bosnia, I've actually been to Jasenovac on both sides. So when you were talking about Stara Gradiška and how the camp is and isn't memorialized, it really struck a chord. You've talked about some of these themes, but something that we've been talking about behind the scenes is the intersection now of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these three things are sort of coming together in the current American climate, where so often, as you said quite eloquently, we're not in the business of comparing the victimization of individual groups, but I do in many ways feel like we've splintered so that those in the Jewish community who are raising the alarm bells about anti-Semitism, sometimes it's also hard to hold the experiences of other groups that are also experiencing similar biases and prejudice.
The short answer, Laura, Professor Cohen, is you're absolutely right. The longer answer is more complicated because we tend to all retreat into our own shells. It's a problem that I said before I was not going to focus on Ukraine, but let's go to Ukraine for a second. The international community and the countries that are neighboring Ukraine have opened their arms to Ukrainian refugees like never before. It is an absolutely heartwarming demonstration of humanitarian concern. And quite frankly, no one is differentiating between Ukrainian Christians and Ukrainian Jews. It is Ukrainians who are being received in Poland, in Moldova, in Hungary, in Romania, and even in Belarus. I sort of compare this and contrast it with a far less receptive attitude toward refugees of other tragedies, whether from the Middle East in contemporary terms or from or Jews during the years of the Holocaust and before. And the question, of course, it comes, or a lack of concern overall with genocides that were happening in Rwanda and elsewhere in Africa. And there is this unfortunate tendency to react when the victims look like us or are like us. And what we need to do is realize that when one hears a call in Germany a couple of years ago, Muslime raus, Muslims out, in a far-right demonstration, that is the functional equivalent of several generations earlier, Juden raus, Jews out. And what we have to come to terms with is the need to open ourselves to recognizing all forms of prejudice, all forms of bigotries as an evil, period, paragraph. We cannot allow, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or the rather vicious attitudes over the years of the COVID-19 pandemic against Asian Americans, or to become acceptable or to become something that we tolerate. Because it's when you tolerate any of these abominations, you open the door to desensitizing ourselves to others. I'm not sure it answers your question, but hopefully it gets us there.
Thank you. We have a comment and question from Tali Nates, who's our colleague from Johannesburg, who will be speaking later today. Thank you, Menachem, for an excellent talk. A part of Dinko Sakic, any other war crimes trials that you can speak about, and how is Jasenovac and World War II history being remembered and taught locally?
Well, in terms of Croatian war crimes, not that many. In terms of Bosnian, you have an entire collection of cases by the ICTY, and of course the equally voluminous decision by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So the body of law there is substantive.
Yes.
What is happening in Croatia is a constant push and pull between responsible historians and members of the Jewish community and members of the Serb community and the responsible academics in the Croat community who want to be historically accurate and come to terms with the crimes of the past, and those who, for nationalist or other reasons, want to obfuscate. Now, let's be very, very clear. Germany today is an exception. Germany has come to terms rather openly and very, very deliberately over the past several decades with the reality of the Holocaust, and has made that part of the national history of the country in much the same way. And I'm not comparing what happened in the United States with respect to slavery. It is part of our consciousness, and it is something that is being repudiated across the board. France, it took longer. It took until 1995 for the French president, at that time Jacques Chirac, to acknowledge French responsibility for the deportation, for the arrest and deportation of French Jews to their death. I say that because Croatia and Serbia are not unique. There is a general impulse in every country not to want to face up to its own past problems, or to mask the past problems as a way of avoiding contemporary problems. So, as my friend Tali knows better than most, it's the rather difficult job of taking a past evils, which in South Africa is apartheid, and dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism, which is masquerading as anti-Zionism. But what on earth Jewish students at a university in South Africa have to do with political decisions made by a government in Jerusalem is beyond me. And yet, that's where the problems arise. So, again, there are no easy answers, but part of the reason we are here is to basically sound a wake-up call, to be a moral conscience, and to remind the community, to remind our contemporaries that there is a past, there is a reality, and they cannot ignore it. And we ignore it at our peril.
Yes, very true. We agree. We absolutely agree. During the course of this day, we are going to be talking about memory and memory activists, the panel that Tali's participating in, and our colleagues Velma Sadic and Eli Tauber in Sarajevo have actually created a new curriculum on the Holocaust for Bosnian schools. And as you speak, Menachem, of the national history of Germany, they are very far, far away from this in Croatia and in Bosnia, now obviously in Serbia too. So there's a push and pull going on in Bosnia with respect to being able to teach about this in the schools, and they think it's very important. And I do agree with this project of the Post-Conflict Research Center in Sarajevo.
Absolutely. Look, there's, as some of my friends from Croatia know full well, there was and is an attempt to obfuscate the past by the creation of a monument in Zagreb to the Holocaust. That monument is very interesting because it basically says, oh, we commemorate the Holocaust, and we commemorate Jews who were Croatian Jews who were sent to Auschwitz and other camps. Except, of course, it's rather silent about the Ustasha, and it's very rather silent about Jasenovac, so that so that we have a falsification, which was sort of the falsification that took place in France until 1995, where it was all a couple of people there in Vichy, and it was all the Germans, and we had nothing to do with it. Well, yes, you did.
Yes. We have, I think, our last question from Chris Leslie. Chris Leslie is known for his photographic work of Bosnia, and he has a film entered in the BH Film Festival coming up next week here in New York City. His question is, how do you go about making this more accessible, more open to the public and not just an academic issue? And I would say you can answer this yourself, Menachem, but we know that museums in places like Laura Cohen's Center and Tali's Center in Johannesburg, these are places of education and they are open to the public, but please add your comments, Menachem.
Well, you're, of course, 100% right. The internet is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it is fertile ground for the darker side, and it gives an avenue to QAnon and others to perpetrate gross distortions. At the same time, it is also provide an incredible opportunity, because to the extent that young people, and they're the one we need to reach, can be reached through social media, and it's done aggressively and it is done intelligently without insulting people's intelligence. Getting the information across, getting the reality across, is the way to start. It is getting younger people to sort of turn around and look at the past and say, oh my God, what happened? And providing them with the tools. And that has to be done. I mean, the museums are important, educational centers are important, but they only reach physically the people who actually bother coming into them. To the extent that we can use the technology that's available to us to get the message out into the schools, into the homes, to make the facts available and to provide a reachable chronicle, a reachable educational tools. That I think is essential, and it's something that I know Tali has been doing with tremendous success in South Africa, and I think we've done the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has done a tremendous job in that respect. UNESCO, we've been working, the World Jewish Congress has created a website about holocaust.org with UNESCO to provide factual information that's now available in about 18 languages. That's the avenue. That's what I think needs to be done in Croatia, in Serbia, and to get young people to confront their own history.
I want to thank you so much, Menachem, and for your incredible comments, your review of history and the context of the Holocaust in the Balkans. Your work at Columbia and Cornell and your work at the World Jewish Congress, everything is very commendable. You are an honorable man, a man who speaks truth to power, and we thank you for reminding us of what has taken place and that we must always remember.
Thank you for your very kind word, and thank you very much for including me in today's important conference.
Indeed. We will regroup in 30 minutes at 11 o'clock for our first panel of the day and of one of two. See everybody in 30 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day if you are off and won't be rejoining us.